There's a photo that almost feels illegal to look at, not because it's classified, not because it's hidden, but because of what it reveals when you finally notice it. It was taken back in 2016 inside a facility in Burlington, Ontario, the WESCAM facility. In that photo, 3 Canadian engineers stand beside 4 Turkish engineers. They're smiling like it's just another ordinary day at work. There are technical diagrams in their hands. Behind them, a drone prototype and a sensor pod that would quietly become one of the most influential eyes-in-the-sky systems of the modern era. And that's the whole point. Nobody talked about this photo because nobody wanted to talk about what it meant. Because once you understand it, you start seeing a reality Washington doesn't like. Trust is not built in speeches. It's not built in press conferences. It's built in workshops between engineers who solve problems together, argue over wiring diagrams, test gear in extreme conditions, and respect each other's skills. For nearly a decade, WESCAM and Turkey's aerospace industry weren't just doing business. They were collaborating. Canadians taught integration. Turks taught optimization. When Turkey hit walls, thermal imaging, high-altitude performance, harsh environments, WESCAM engineers didn't just email instructions. They flew to Ankara and fixed it in person. This wasn't seller and buyer. This was partnership. And that partnership created something that wasn't supposed to happen. A drone program outside America's control that actually worked. By 2022, the Bayraktar TB2, carrying Canadian sensor technology, became the most exported combat drone in the world, not because it was flashy, not because it was propaganda, but because it was reliable, affordable, and operational. Ukraine, Libya, multiple air forces, real conflicts, real results. Now jump to February 5, 2026. Mark Carney stands in front of reporters and says something that sounds polite on the surface. Turkey is a leader in manufacturing globally, and there's tremendous opportunity for defense cooperation. Most people heard diplomacy, but anyone who knows the WESCAM story heard a warning shot. We've done this before, and next time we're not asking Washington. Because here's the part that changes everything. The WESCAM-Turkey partnership succeeded precisely because it stayed under the radar. No dramatic headlines, no Pentagon interference, no Congress screaming about technology theft, 2 NATO allies building something effective while America was busy selling expensive systems that often arrive late, cost more than promised, and come with strings attached. And now Carney is staring at Canada's next major defense problem, replacing the aging CH-146 Griffon helicopters. And he's asking the question that should make a few defense boardrooms go cold. If Canadian and Turkish engineers helped build drones that defended Ukraine, why couldn't they build helicopters that defend Canada's Arctic? This isn't just about equipment. This is about leverage. To understand how we got here, we have to go back to 2010, before the drones went viral, before anyone cared about Turkey's defense ambitions, and before Canada started realizing how trapped it had become in American defense procurement. Back then, Canada's procurement was predictable. Safe, American-dominated. If we needed helicopters, we bought American. If we needed jets, American. Radars, systems, platforms, American. Even when Canada built advanced parts like sensors, those sensors usually ended up bolted onto US-made platforms. Canada built the eyes, but didn't control where those eyes went or how they were used. And WESCAM was Canada's quiet tech success story. Founded in the 1970s, it specialized in something extremely specific: electro-optical and infrared sensors mounted on gyro-stabilized turrets. Not consumer cameras, not hobby gear. These are systems that can track vehicles moving at highway speed from miles away, while the aircraft itself is bouncing through turbulence. They can shift from optical zoom to thermal imaging instantly. They can laser designate targets for guided weapons, and they can stream real-time video to operators far away. By 2010, WESCAM sensors were trusted and widely used by NATO members. Canada used them. The US used them. Britain, France, Australia all used them. Proven, reliable. Then Turkey called. Turkey had been working on an indigenous drone program for years. Their goal wasn't just to build drones. Their goal was to break dependency. They wanted something they could export without the United States approving every sale. They wanted a drone that could operate in harsh environments for long-endurance missions, and they wanted sensors that could actually deliver. Turkey had options: American, Israeli, and Canadian. The American option came with restrictions, monitoring, and export controls, basically a legal leash that Washington could pull whenever it wanted. And with Turkey becoming more independent under Erdogan, that leash was never going to feel stable. The Israeli option was technically strong and politically impossible. That left the Canadians. And here's where the story gets controversial. WESCAM didn't just offer a product. They offered something Americans almost never offer: technology transfer. The 2011 agreement wasn't a simple purchase. It was training, co-development, and integration work. Turkish engineers came to Canada. Canadian engineers went to Turkey. They worked side by side to integrate the MX-15 sensor pod into the TB2 airframe. Turkey gained the ability to maintain and repair and eventually modify the system. Why would a company do that? Because some engineers understand something politicians often don't. The best way to create long-term business isn't dependency, it's partnership. If Turkey succeeded, Turkey would need more sensors and upgrades, and they'd return to the company that helped them succeed. It was risky, and it paid off. By 2014, TB2 drones equipped with Canadian sensors were flying real missions. By 2016, exports began. By 2019, sales expanded. By 2022, TB2s were in more than 30 countries. Meanwhile, America was pushing systems like the Reaper, powerful but expensive, tightly controlled, and wrapped in restrictions. Turkey and Canada quietly built something cheaper, easier to operate, and this is the key word, sovereign. Countries that bought TB2s owned them fully. No American officers hovering nearby. No software locks, no kill switch fear, and the drone started changing real battle outcomes. Then came Ukraine, and TB2 became more than a machine, it became a symbol. And that's when the world asked the question nobody in Washington wanted asked. If a $5 million Turkish drone with Canadian sensors can destroy systems worth 10 times more, what does that say about the expensive Western programs Canada is being pressured to buy? Hold that thought, because in Part 2, we get to the moment this partnership officially became a scandal, and how an embargo meant to stop Turkey ended up proving something even bigger. A threat to the system. Because defense isn't just about weapons. It's about control. And Washington doesn't like losing control, even to allies. The partnership almost died in April 2021. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister at the time stepped in front of cameras and announced that Canada was suspending exports of drone technology to Turkey. The official reason was predictable: concerns about Canadian components being used in conflict zones, and fear they were being used in ways that violated humanitarian principles. On paper, it sounded like a human rights move, a moral decision, but here's what the public wasn't told clearly. The pressure wasn't only coming from inside Canada, it was coming from Washington. By 2021, Turkey had become what the Pentagon never wanted to see, a drone superpower that didn't depend on American tech, American approvals, or American supervision. Worse, Turkey was exporting drones to countries the US refused to sell to, countries that wanted capable systems but didn't want political strings, expensive contracts, or foreign oversight. And in every one of those drones, the eyes were built in Canada. So the Pentagon found a pressure point. It couldn't stop Turkey from making drones, but it could try to cut off critical components by pushing Canada to stop the pipeline. And the embargo happened. But here's the twist. It didn't work. Because by the time Canada finally shut the door, Turkey had already learned enough. The partnership was so deep that Turkey could adapt. They began developing their own indigenous sensor systems to replace Canadian pods. Turkish defense firm Aselsan developed systems that started showing up on new production runs. Turkey kept building. TB3, Akinci, Kızılelma. Bigger, better, more independent. Canada didn't cripple Turkey. Canada only crippled itself by freezing a relationship with one of the fastest-growing defense industries on the planet. And for 5 years, the partnership went cold. Engineers who had built trust got cut off. Projects were shelved. Canadian companies lost access to a market that was exploding globally. Turkey didn't stop moving, it just moved forward without Canada. Now jump back to early 2026, and look at what Mark Carney is facing. Carney isn't a classic politician, he's a technocrat, a risk manager, a man trained to see vulnerabilities like a surgeon sees weak points in a body, and the vulnerability was obvious. Canada's dependence on the United States for defense procurement had turned into a national weakness. The F-35 program was behind schedule and massively expensive. The US was making threats around NORAD arrangements. Trump was openly talking about Canada like it was a bargaining chip, even floating 51st state language like it was a joke, while Canadians could feel it wasn't really a joke. Every time Canada tried to act independently, Washington pulled a lever. Carney saw risk concentration, so he did what risk managers do: diversify. And when he looked for partners with a proven track record, the WESCAM files practically screamed one name: Turkey. Turkey had already proven it could handle sensitive technology. It had proven it could build operational capability. It had proven it could export systems and deliver results. And most importantly, it had proven it wouldn't fold just because Washington made a phone call. That last part matters, because Carney didn't just need a supplier. He needed a partner who could stand up under pressure. So Carney didn't start by calling Erdogan in a dramatic headline moment. He started where the trust had always been built, with engineers, CEOs, and the people who had done it before. Can we do it again? This time the question wasn't about drones. This time it was about helicopters. Canada's CH-146 Griffon helicopters have been flying since the 1990s. Upgraded repeatedly, yes, but aging fast. And Canada needs a replacement that can operate in the Arctic, do search and rescue, support special operations, and crucially be maintained and upgraded inside Canada without begging American contractors every time something breaks. This program has a name, Tactical Aviation Capability Set, or TACSET. It's not a small contract. Estimates put its lifetime value somewhere around $10 to $18 billion Canadian dollars. For years, everyone assumed an American company would win. Bell Textron, the company behind the Griffon, was the presumed favorite. They had familiarity, the infrastructure, the contacts, the safe path. Then Carney started talking to Turkey, and suddenly the safe path didn't look so safe. Because Turkish Aerospace Industries has been developing the T-625 Gökbey, a medium utility helicopter designed for exactly the kind of missions Canada needs: cold weather operations, multi-role capability, and modular design that allows new systems to be integrated without being trapped inside one supplier's ecosystem. And here's where the pattern becomes hard to ignore. The T-625 was originally designed with engines connected to Western suppliers. But after political restrictions tightened, Turkey had to look elsewhere. And one of the places Turkey looked? Pratt Whitney, Canada, a Canadian engine powerhouse, deeply capable, based in Quebec. Do you see what Carney is thinking now? A co-production agreement could look like this. Turkey supplies airframe and avionics. Pratt & Whitney Canada supplies engines. WESCAM supplies sensors. Final assembly happens in Canada, possibly Montreal, creating skilled jobs and keeping upgrades inside the country. And then comes the forbidden sentence in defense politics. Canada would own the platform, not just operate it, own it. Blueprints, software access, modification rights, integration freedom, even export capability without begging Washington. That's not a procurement choice. That's statecraft. Because right now, the US holds a lot of cards. If parts stop coming, Canada's systems suffer. If intelligence sharing gets threatened, Canada's awareness goes dark. If NORAD terms shift, Canada has limited alternatives. But if Canada has a functional defense partnership outside America's monopoly, then Washington has to negotiate. And Washington is not happy. The moment Carney hinted at Turkey, you could almost hear the gears grinding in Washington. Because this is how the defense world works. The moment a country tries to diversify, the pressure doesn't come like a loud threat at first. It comes like a flood. Lobbyists, reports, concerns, friendly op-eds, anonymous leaks, and suddenly the same people who never cared about Canada's sovereignty start caring deeply about interoperability. In the 3 weeks after Carney's statement, American defense lobbyists reportedly swarmed Parliament Hill. That isn't rumor-level behavior, that's standard procedure. When billions are on the line, companies don't just pitch. They pressure, and the messaging was predictable. Lockheed Martin, tied to the F-35 debate, leaned into fear. If Canada works with Turkey, it could risk NORAD interoperability. It could risk intelligence sharing. It could complicate the relationship with the United States. Bell Textron started emphasizing Canadian jobs, carefully leaving out how many of those jobs are basically assembly line roles for American-designed parts, built to American specifications, in a system where Canada still doesn't truly control the platform. Then came the real weapon: intelligence narratives. Anonymous Pentagon sources began suggesting to media outlets that Turkey couldn't be trusted, that Erdogan's relationships with Russia and China made Turkey a security risk, that any partnership with Ankara could compromise Five Eyes intelligence. This is the same playbook that helped justify the 2021 embargo. The difference now? It's not landing the same way. Because Canada is in a different mood in 2026 than it was in 2021. Carney isn't speaking into an empty room. Public opinion has shifted, partly because Canadians have watched the US behave less like a stable ally and more like a volatile power that treats relationships like leverage. And there's another reason the narrative is cracking. Ukraine, remember those TB2 drones? The ones that became legends in the first weeks of the war? The ones that hit convoys, disrupted advances, provided targeting data, and produced footage that turned into morale fuel across the world? Those TB2s carried Canadian optics. That puts Canada in a strange position. Because if Canada keeps an embargo and blocks Turkish exports that could help Ukraine, Canada isn't protecting human rights. Canada is potentially restricting capabilities that help a democracy defend itself from invasion. But if Canada lifts restrictions and allows cooperation, then Canada is publicly admitting what the Pentagon doesn't want, admitted that the Turkish-Canadian model works. Either way, Washington loses control of the narrative, and this is why the helicopter debate is bigger than helicopters. It's about rewriting Canada's story, a story Canada has lived under for decades. For over half a century, Canada has quietly accepted a belief that feels like a law of physics, that Canada can't build a real independent defense industry, that Canada must buy platforms from the US, and that Canadian companies should be component suppliers rather than system owners. This belief has haunted Canada since one moment that still stings in the national memory: the cancellation of the Avro Aero in 1959. Since then, Canada's defense identity has often been reduced to this: operate American systems, contribute to American-led frameworks, and never stray too far. But the WESCAM partnership proved something that should shake that belief at its core. Middle powers can build world-class defense technology if they cooperate smartly. Turkey and Canada didn't need a superpower babysitter to build an effective drone platform. They just needed trust between engineers and a deal structured around shared capability. And that success story created a new question. If Canada and Turkey did it once, under the radar, what happens if Canada does it again, openly, at scale? That's why this story is being fought on two levels. Level 1, procurement. Who gets the contract? Level 2, power. Who controls Canada's options? If Canada goes the Turkish route and co-produces helicopters, Canada gains leverage. And leverage changes everything. Suddenly, when Washington demands something, Canada can say, "We have alternatives." That's the nightmare. Because monopoly power is only power as long as you have no other supplier. And now Washington can see a crack in its monopoly. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Washington isn't wrong to be nervous. Not because Turkey is some villain in a movie, but because partnerships create independence. And independence reduces control. That's why the warnings are coming fast and aggressive. They'll say Turkey is unpredictable. They'll say Turkey is risky. They'll say if Canada works with Turkey, Canada could lose access to Five Eyes intelligence. They'll say Canada is jeopardizing NORAD. And here's what you should watch for, the shift from technical arguments to emotional arguments. Because if this was only about technical compatibility, the debate would stay technical. But when the debate becomes character assassination, moral panic, and trust us or else, it's usually because the real concern isn't technology. It's control. Now, does that mean Carney's plan is perfect? No. Co-production agreements are complex. There are supply chain risks. There are political risks. Turkey has its own internal politics and its own strategic goals. But Carney's whole point is that Canada already knows how to manage that risk because Canada already did it once and it worked. And that leads to the biggest question of all. What happens when Washington tries to retaliate? Because make no mistake, if Canada signs a serious co-production agreement with Turkey, Washington won't just complain. It will respond. The tools are obvious. Threats about intelligence sharing, pressure campaigns, tariffs, and leaks designed to make the partnership look reckless. But Washington can't change one thing. The Bayraktar TB2 worked. It worked enough to become a global export success. It worked enough to reshape battlefield thinking. It worked enough to embarrass more expensive systems. And it worked enough to prove that middle powers can build modern defense capability without being trapped inside the U.S. defense ecosystem. When you buy a platform you don't control, you're renting your sovereignty. You might own the machine physically, but you don't own the blueprint, the software, the upgrade path, or the freedom to export it. You are dependent. And dependency is leverage. Carney's plan attacks dependency directly. If Canada co-produces helicopters with Turkey, and integrates Canadian engines and Canadian sensors, and assembles them in Canada, then Canada gains something it hasn't had in decades: options. And options are power, because if Washington ever tries to force Canada's hand through procurement pressure, trade threats, or intelligence leverage, Canada can respond with a sentence Washington hates: "We have alternatives." Now let's be honest. If Canada moves forward, the backlash won't be gentle. Washington will likely frame this as a security risk. It will argue Turkey is too close to Russia, too close to China, too unpredictable under Erzurum. But here's the thing. Those arguments already existed during the TB2 era, and yet the partnership still produced results without Canada's security collapsing. In fact, the partnership produced something that benefited NATO indirectly: a proven drone platform that multiple allies adopted, and a battlefield lesson in affordability and effectiveness. And then there's Ukraine again. Ukraine is the emotional pressure point Washington can't fully control. Because TB2 wasn't just a weapon, it became a story, a symbol, and symbols shape public opinion. If Canada blocks cooperation that could support Ukraine, Canada looks like it's helping Russian outcomes indirectly. If Canada supports cooperation, Canada looks like it's supporting democratic defense. Either way, it's messy for Washington's messaging. And Carney understands that because Carney is reading signals like a market analyst reads charts. He's seeing that Canada's public mood is shifting toward diversification. He's seeing that Canada's public mood is shifting toward diversification. He's seeing that Canadians are tired of being treated like a client state. And he's also seeing the strategic math. Canada's biggest defense vulnerability is reliance on one supplier, the United States, for too many critical systems. That's not an alliance, that's a bottleneck. Carney's move is about breaking the bottleneck. And the helicopter decision is the perfect battleground because it's not theoretical. It's not symbolic. It's a real procurement with real money and real consequences. Replacing the Griffon fleet isn't optional. Canada needs a platform that works in the Arctic, supports critical missions, and can be maintained reliably. If Canada chooses the standard path, another American solution, Canada stays inside the same dependency loop. If Canada chooses co-production with Turkey, Canada steps into a new model: shared engineering, domestic assembly, domestic upgrade capacity, and export flexibility. That's why this decision could reshape Canada's defense posture for decades. But here's the payoff, the thing you were promised at the start. The real story is not Canada versus the US, the real story is this. For the first time in a long time, Canada is acting like a country that wants control over its own future. And the proof that it can be done isn't a politician's speech. It's a decade of engineering collaboration that already happened, quietly, while the world looked the other way. That 2016 photo matters because it shows what's possible when partnerships are built on competence instead of politics. Now the question is courage, because if Carney follows through, retaliation will come. Washington will apply pressure. There will be headlines, leaks, warnings, threats, and political drama. But Washington can't erase the technical reality. A Turkish platform with Canadian sensors became one of the most effective exported drones of its generation. Washington can't erase the battlefield impact in Ukraine. Washington can't magically make American platforms cheaper, faster, and less restricted. And Washington can't force Canada to stay dependent if Canada finally decides not to. So here's the uncomfortable question that this story forces onto the table. If Canada can build real defense capability through partnerships with other middle powers, why has Canada spent decades acting like it can't? The answer might not be flattering, but it is freeing. Because once you accept that Canada can build, co-produce, and control its own defense systems, the old assumptions collapse. And the handshake nobody noticed becomes something else, a blueprint. A blueprint that could end the North American defense monopoly, not with missiles, not with threats, but with engineers, contracts, and the decision to stop asking permission. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Canada should lift the 2021 restrictions and rebuild defense cooperation with Turkey, or is the risk too high? Comment your answer, and if you want more breakdowns like this, hit like and subscribe. Because this fight isn't only about helicopters or drones, it's about whether Canada wants to be a partner or a client. Thanks for watching and welcome to the resurrection.